Hey, so I am super excited for today's episode of Calmly Coping. Today I am speaking with Tanya Cole-Lesnick. She has been a psychotherapist and coach since 1995, and she helps people to clear energetic clutter so they can focus on what matters most to them. She does this by asking and helping clients to access and honor their truth, to change habits that don't serve them, and to heal faulty narratives so that they are living in alignment inside and out. Her work revolves around a combination of intimate therapeutic groups and individual sessions as the sharing of inner worlds and being human together in a safe space, collectively and individually, is an incredibly powerful combination that leads to lasting transformation. So our conversation today, whether you are interested in group therapy or not, is going to be really transformational for you. I think this episode will really resonate if you struggle with people pleasing, not feeling good enough, and you're looking for more clarity to live in alignment with your needs. So I'm super excited for you to get into it. Hey, Tati here, and welcome to Calmly Coping. I am here with Tanya today, so it is great to have you here. So can you let us know a little bit more about yourself and how you got into doing, I know you specialize in doing group therapy.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and for our conversation. I started my career out as a graphic designer. And when I was in my mid-20s, I was really struggling to have a long-term love relationship. And I wanted one very badly. I really envisioned myself as being somebody who would get married one day and have a family. And I wasn't sure how that was going to happen because my relationships never seemed to get very far. And at the time, so this was over 30 years ago, and at the time I felt a lot of stigma connected to therapy, although it was in New York City, which was probably the area that was most accepting of therapy. But still, I think I didn't see my problems as legitimate enough, and I didn't first go towards therapy. But at some point in that process, I think I really wanted it badly enough that I decided that it would be worth trying, even if it's not the right answer for me, just to try it, because I really wanted to understand better what was going on for me so that I could shift something. So I got some names. I got connected to this wonderful therapist named Bonnie, and that experience itself was immediately I felt safe. I felt like I could tell her my story. I didn't feel judged by her. It felt like she could hear me and see me. And so that by itself was pretty quickly healing. Of course, not all the way, but just to open up to that process. And pretty early on, she suggested that I add group therapy to the mix. And she ran both. She led the individual sessions and then also the group. And the thought of that really terrified me. I was being much more vulnerable with her than I really had been with anybody else before. And the thought of opening up in a similar way to people who at that time were strangers scared me. But she thought that it would really be helpful. I was building some trust in her. I was sort of intrigued as well. So I decided to go ahead and do it. And that experience really of group therapy, and it wasn't always easy. I definitely had some challenges along the way, but it was in this process of sharing my own inner journey with other people who were sharing their own, and starting to connect to other people. And I went into that experience feeling very flawed. I was worried that there really was something unlovable about me. And maybe that was why I was struggling to have a long-term love relationship. So going into that in the back of my mind, that was what I was afraid I was going to get verified, that I was, in fact, unlovable, very flawed. But I was able to connect to people who I started to admire. As I got to know them, I admired them, and they shared very similar insecurities that I went into that experience feeling myself. So it helped me not believe them so much, those insecurities, because if these amazing people that I was connecting to had similar insecurities, it couldn't be about the insecurities themselves being the truth. And so it helped me start to realize that it was the human condition. This was not about people being as unacceptable as we all felt at various times. And I did some work on connecting to myself. So what happened is pretty early on, I did in fact meet the person who later became my husband, and he and I just celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary in September. So congrats. Thanks. And so that happened. We have 2 grown, amazing daughters. That part of the journey was what I was longing for, what I hoped for. But what I didn't anticipate was connecting to myself, liking myself, learning how to like myself, learning how to take care of myself, check in about what I needed, learn about needs, learn that I had needs, all of that. And so because that was so powerful and life-changing, and it offered me such a level of life satisfaction that I hadn't experienced before, I decided to go back to school. I got my master's in social work and did some coaching work soon after that. And I've been doing that work now for over 27 years, almost 28 years now. I've been doing that work, always finding groups, small, intimate groups, to be such a powerful way to help people access some of that inner stuff that's not always as accessible individually, and make some really long-lasting change in their lives. So that's been what I've dedicated my life to.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing. And as you were sharing, I can imagine you had mentioned feeling hesitant to go into therapy. And I think it's great that you took that leap and went in. And then I can imagine it would be even more intimidating to go into that group environment. Like, what was that experience like for you? Because, sharing one-on-one, I think there's more of that sense of getting an idea of, can I trust this person? Mm-hmm. What might they be thinking of me? But then I can think of having more people in the room. It can seem like there's more opinions and more potential for judgment. So I'm curious what your experience was with that.
For sure. Yeah. I had a bit of a rocky beginning with the group too, because the first session, the group leader didn't introduce me to the others, which I was shocked by, because I thought for sure, I've never been in a social situation where I was the new person and wasn't introduced. So that was a little shocking for me. And the other people in group knew each other. So I was the newbie. They knew each other. They're talking almost like picking up in the middle of somewhere, because they've already talked through some of this stuff. And I felt very much on the outside. So that was uncomfortable. Now, I always introduce people when they come into my group. So I would say that was a bit of an unusual situation. And when I tried to understand why she did it that way, I don't know that I ever checked this out with her, but my understanding was she must have been trying to help me find my voice, develop strength in my voice. And whether or not that was true, that was a message that I held on to and still hold on to, just knowing that my voice is important and helping myself have a voice, even if it feels uncomfortable at times. So that was the first session. The second session, I actually did get challenged by somebody in group who I went in, as you know, really longing for a long-term love relationship. And there was somebody in group who said to me that he could spot my neediness immediately. And that to me was so uncomfortable. I really did feel this urge, like I wanted to run out of the room, but then I kind of knew that if I did that, I'd have a whole nother series of uncomfortable things that I'd have to deal with. So I tolerated it. And, but it was really from almost like the worst thing possible was in my mind was somebody saying that. And even though he wasn't saying, oh, you are unlovable, that's the way I heard it. So the way I heard it was like, oh my God, my flaws are more visible than I thought they were. And so originally, I think I put a lot of energy into sort of curating this version of myself that I was wanting to show the world. And the fact that he saw my neediness, even though I thought I was so effectively doing that, it was actually freeing in a way, even though obviously it was so uncomfortable. But in another way, it was like, all right, well, maybe it's just not even worth me trying to hide stuff then, because clearly it's not working. So, so there is that as well. And then, you know, relationships do form, and there are people that, you know, maybe somebody might push on something that feels a little bit tender, where somebody else might be more reassuring, and finding that way. I mean, for sure, as I run groups, I get a lot of fear is expressed to me as well when people are considering group and feel like that feels scary. I don't want to share that stuff with people I don't know. So it's definitely a very common reaction.
Yeah, so it sounds like there was that honesty from that person that was very blunt, but then also was helpful for you to maybe look inward and reflect more.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that, you know, with the group environment, I can imagine that it feels vulnerable sharing those things. So can you speak more to that? And, you know, is there any benefit coming from that vulnerability of sharing things that, you know, many times we don't share in our workplace, even in our personal lives? You know, many people try to keep things to themselves, especially my listeners who tend to be high achievers. So they tend to kind of put this mask on and put all this pressure on themselves and like, I got it all together. So sometimes I think it can be hard for people to lower that mask and express that vulnerability.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think in the work that I've done, for sure, I know that vulnerability, when people are able to be vulnerable, whether it's they're sharing something with me they've never talked about before or rarely talk about, or sharing something in a group, I always get a little bit excited because I know that is where transformation lies. And that has been my experience as well, when I've been able to be more vulnerable and put something out there in that kind of more tender way. What tends to come back to me is people having permission to do the same. You know, so if somebody in a group situation, then if somebody is sharing something vulnerable, I often find that somebody else then will feel a little safer to share something vulnerable. And that those, you know, tolerating some of that discomfort and putting yourself out there in that way does start to lead to change. And it's so uncomfortable, of course. I remember when I was in the group that I was in, I knew I was being very vulnerable when I started to get really cold. I would get really chilled or sweaty. Like it would go either way, but I knew I was having kind of a reaction, a physical reaction to what I was sharing. And there is something about when other people are doing it too, it allows, I think, us to not feel so alone, and that there is a level of safety if the environment is sort of created in a way that makes a container that is safe, that people can start to share it, and transformation happens from that place. Yeah,
and I think that's powerful what you shared, that feeling of not being alone, because I think nowadays, especially, obviously with the pandemic and with people being online more, I think there's more of a lack of connection. And, it can be that connection through social media or the internet. But oftentimes I think that can be more of like a superficial or surface level, depending on how you're utilizing it. And I think that it's really needed to have those deeper sort of conversations and kind of discovery and connections with other people.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think I agree that people are sort of starving for it more, that connection. And even though we're out and about more than we have been in the past, I think that there is still more of a trend to staying home more, isolating more, and the in-person sort of social group experiences is still, I don't think, as rich as it was prior to the pandemic, but not to say it was so perfect then either. And I think that, for people to be in a space where there is that level of safety and connection and being more genuine and real and sharing some of that inner stuff, such a relief. I just went on a retreat in Italy with this amazing woman, Jennifer Pasteloff, who creates these, just the community that she builds is a community where people know it's okay to be vulnerable with each other. And I know I mentioned to you as well, I'm going to be running a small intimate retreat with another coach and therapist in April 1st, April 2nd. And it's a little bit different than the group work that I do. It's a little more kind of intensified because we're spending this more condensed time together. And during that time can go inward in a way that we don't necessarily have the time and space to do that. But again, the safety is so important to be able to go and be vulnerable and share some of those inner parts of ourselves with each other. There is risk involved. And I think when safety gets developed, and so it could be that I share vulnerably, and so that helps people feel that they have permission, or somebody else who has some level of trust in me knows that it's safe for them to share a little bit and be vulnerable themselves. That can help open up permission to others, and then it kind of creates this space that otherwise doesn't typically exist for us. It's not the way we share most of the time out and about in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm curious to hear, because I know you had mentioned, first, before we got onto recording, you had mentioned what you help people with is clearing that energetic clutter. So I'm curious, what does that mean exactly?
So the way I mean, or what I mean when I say energetic clutter, it's just like physical clutter in our physical spaces. Those are the things we don't really use, we don't really love, or there's just too much of it. We could love and use all of it, but if there's too much of it, it can be very overwhelming to have it in our space. So energetic clutter, to me, are the things that demand our attention and kind of take a lot of our energy. And it's not the stuff that we would necessarily choose to be focusing on if we're looking at the big picture of what we want in our lives, in our world. So it's things like limiting beliefs and so an example of that, one that I've shared a lot about my own life, is I definitely realized at some point that I had people-pleasing tendencies. And the reason why I had developed that in my life was because I feared rejection if I wasn't accommodating, if I wasn't nice to people, if I wasn't saying yes to certain things, that I would be abandoned, or rejected. And so I had developed sort of just different ways that I would show up for other people before checking in with myself to see what I wanted and needed. So doing that and being an automatic pilot with that would be an example of energetic clutter, where I would be doing things for other people where I just wasn't really honoring myself in some of those decisions. So getting clear on what might be leading you towards certain behaviors, and also just different patterns, things where maybe people take on. I know a lot of people struggle with feelings of worth, for example, and feel like they've got to accomplish so many things before they have earned the right to rest or to do something that they really might want to choose otherwise. So that's another example of like a pattern combined with limiting belief. And so the amount of space that those examples can take up in our psyches, in our bodies, and energetically, we can so often get depleted before we ever come back to check in with ourselves to see what we want or need. And if we do at the end of all that, often it's too late anyway. I mean, we're just at that point maybe just zoning out and crashing and not able to really know what we want or need at that point.
So it sounds like it's more these, like you mentioned, the autopilot and the patterns that we get stuck in that are taking us further away from really connecting with and listening to ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And you speak about one thing that is, living in alignment. So that's something I've heard before and I'm familiar with, but I'm not sure if maybe my listeners are. What would you, or how would you describe that?
Yeah, so living in alignment is when you really are in the habit of checking in with yourself, seeing what you want and need, and being able to honor what you want and need along the way. And being in alignment can be different from morning to night. It can change, there can be different things that you need at various points. So it's things like honoring energy levels. Do you need to rest? Do you need to get out of the house and be really active doing something? Are you experiencing enough connection in your life? Are you experiencing enough richness? Are there things that you, like, for example, I shared the story when I used to be a graphic designer and then I became a therapist and coach. I really neglected that creative side of myself for a while and realized that, even quite recently, realized that I want to connect more to that part of myself. And so starting to learn those little nuances about ourselves. And, I raised these amazing girls and now women. And certainly that took a certain amount of energy. Maybe I wasn't in a place yet to reconnect to that creative part of myself because I was busy focusing on other things. So it's not that, this whole time I've been missing this piece. But as I keep checking in with myself and learning, what do I need along the way? And then honoring those things. And then what happens when we're in alignment is we can get into things like a state of flow where we're doing something that's very meaningful to us, and we can get lost in some of those activities, and there's some movement to it. And also, there can be some synergy that comes up when we're connecting to people that spark something that's exciting to us. Then our energy actually can expand in those kinds of situations where we're really connecting to our hearts and what we want. And so it's the opposite then of depleting. We can really get energized by different things we start to include in our lives that really feel meaningful and exciting to us.
Yeah. So, and maybe this is a big question, but why do you think it is that maybe it's nowadays, or maybe it's something that's been happening forever, people do tend to get disconnected from listening to themselves? And you mentioned, those, if you're struggling with worth, feeling like, okay, I need to achieve more, work more to, before I can earn rest, which I know is something that absolutely my listeners can probably like nod their heads and say, yeah. And like the people pleasing,
yeah,
and all of those patterns. What do you think it is that gets people stuck in those places?
I think they're so entrenched, some of those patterns. So when we're growing up and we're getting conditioned by the families that we grew up in, the cultures, all of that, we're learning what's safe for us and what isn't safe for us. And so all of those things that got developed for protective reasons. So if we go back to the people pleasing, I grew up with a mother who experienced a lot of anxiety, but the way it came out, it was many years before. She didn't have the kind of resources that we have today. The way that it came out was often as anger and rage. So as a kid growing up in that environment, I learned how to not set her off, because that felt very unsafe to not set her off. So that was probably the beginning of some of this people-pleasing pattern, but that was protective. I learned how to do that. And those patterns that we developed so often are protective. Our brain is just trying to figure out safe or unsafe. And it doesn't mean safe or unsafe in the most dangerous way, although it could be, but I just mean like, are you going to get positive feedback from something or negative feedback? Like if the only choices are safe or unsafe, you're going to go towards the things that get supported positively and move away from the things that you get negative feedback from doing. So I think it's those reasons. They got developed for a reason. They get very entrenched. And if you're not able to catch some of that and start to question it and realize, oh, wait, that's not even who I am, then you'll keep going. And I think a lot of the patterns that are not, that are so out of alignment for so many of us, I think we believe them for such a long time. Like, it's better to be productive. It's more successful to work really hard until, we're exhausted. I mean, there's a lot of messaging out there that that gets reinforced by our culture, and, workaholism is still celebrated. Moms who do it all and are selfless still get celebrated. I mean, there are a lot of things in our culture that go against this idea of pausing, taking care of yourself, seeing what you need, giving yourself rest, prioritizing something that's fun over being productive, those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the fact that these messages are so often reinforced, it can make it harder for people to escape them, because maybe their partner or families are also reinforcing those things, or their workplaces have those kinds of cultures. So what would you suggest for somebody who's realizing like, okay, this isn't working for me, or I haven't been listening to myself and I want to start to break these patterns, or I want to start to listen to myself more? Mm-hmm. Where do you suggest that they begin?
I think to find a way to get quiet with yourself, whatever that can sort of feel like a starting point for somebody. So it could be something as concrete even as setting some random reminders in your phone, like that can go off at random times as a reminder, like, how you doing? Like something like that, where it's just a reminder to check in with yourself. Getting quiet, I think, is so important. Some people journal, some people don't. Some people meditate, some people don't. I don't think there's a one way, although I do think the getting quiet piece is an important thing, because if we're doing that depletion thing that we were talking about earlier and getting so caught up with all the energetic clutter, we're not going to be able to connect to ourselves. So I think to find a way that feels right to somebody to just take a few minutes here and there to check in as a starting point. I think that that's a great way to start. Could be morning pages. Julia Cameron, who wrote The Artist's Way, talks about journaling first thing in the morning, maybe 3 pages, just kind of doing a brain dump. That's a great way to journal, although there's all kinds of ways to journal. And sometimes people get really overwhelmed by journaling and don't feel like they can get themselves to follow through. And that's okay. I mean, I think for people to even watch, how are you talking to yourself in your head? And one of the things that I find so much is that people really beat up on themselves badly. And so they say things to themselves like, and I think the most common one that I hear is, what's the matter with me? And there is this thing where there's an expectation and they're struggling to meet the expectation, and then they get mad at themselves. And so then that kind of perpetuates this lack of connecting to yourself, because if you're trying to connect to yourself and you're struggling and then you're beating up on yourself, it's going to interfere with you really being able to be kind to yourself. I mean, that's one of the things that I say a lot in some of the videos that I make, is just a reminder, be kind to yourself through this process. So that's sort of a very gray answer to your question about what can people do. But I think to find a few minutes here and there of connecting to yourself, getting quiet, and it could be putting your phone away and putting devices away earlier in the evening than typically you do, and sort of being structured about it and having some sort of plan that, okay, I'm going to do this one thing so I can get some traction with this one thing and see what I learn. And you can switch it, but give it a little time to see whether or not it's a place that feels like it's allowing you to connect to yourself.
Yeah, I think those are some excellent suggestions. And I'm curious to hear, what was the healing journey like for you from going from that place of feeling, because you mentioned, like, you hear people say, like, what's the matter with me? And you took that comment that that person said as like, oh, I'm flawed, I think, or, there's something wrong with me. So what was that healing journey like for you to go from that place of feeling not good enough to where you are now?
Yeah, I think it was really a combination of being vulnerable, sharing some things like we talked about earlier, and also listening to other people share their stories and allowing to be as present as I could be. Because prior to that, I was so busy curating this version of myself, like I had mentioned, so that I wasn't even very present when I was connecting to other people, because I was busy trying to collect information. All right, what should I say next? How should I present next? That kind of thing. And so in the group situation, trusting it enough to listen, sometimes spent more time listening and to hear other people. But often it's in the stories when we hear other people share things about their lives and their inner worlds where we can see ourselves in that, and it helps us to connect to ourselves. So doing that sometimes, sharing something other times, especially if I had something that I knew that I wanted to share. But one of the places actually where I had the most growth was how to share when it didn't feel as obvious to me. Because the pattern for me was, if other people's problems feel like there's more urgency to them, I'll just sit in the back. I'll be quiet. I'll watch. I'll let them have a chance to speak. And what I found was that there was a pattern to that, where it was hard for me to share if I didn't feel like I had something specific, something that had a certain amount of urgency. And yet I knew that overall, or I learned along the way that overall, I needed to be able to put myself out there and receive whatever I could receive from putting myself out there, even if I didn't have something of urgency, because otherwise I would just be on the back burner week after week after week. And so naming that, putting it out there. There was one group in particular I remember where a woman was talking about a high school reunion that she had been to, and she was in her 60s, and it was, it brought stuff up, but she was sharing beyond what it was bringing up for her. It felt very superficial at some point, and I remember feeling really confused because I didn't want to hear the ins and outs that she was getting into at that point, because she wasn't talking about her own growth anymore. It felt superficial. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to move the conversation towards something, and I didn't know how to do it because I didn't have anything urgent. And so what I ended up doing was saying all of that and saying, and this feels impolite, and I don't know how to redirect things when that feels impolite, and I want to honor you, as I was talking directly to this woman and feeling very stuck about it. And it led to a very rich conversation with everybody in the group. But it took a lot of, I think, trusting the process for me to be able to say all of that. And that was very healing because it allowed me to be present, to say something, even though my problem wasn't the biggest problem in the room, but I still wanted to be able to show up, and I wasn't sure how to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I love that example at the end, and I'm hearing that it's really just the process of becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable, sharing things yourself, and then also listening to others and sharing those things maybe that you might be thinking in reaction to others while still being polite about it, while still being understanding, because I would imagine maybe that woman, maybe that's something that she does with her personal relationships, and she might not even recognize because people are afraid of insulting her or afraid of making her feel bad.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good insight that you had. And yeah, I think that was a pattern for her as well, where she would get down onto these like superficial little tracks and not connect to what she wanted to get out of group. So yeah, all of our patterns kind of overlap with each other, and we can really learn from any kind of a sort of push or response or what resonates as we hear from each other. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think it's really great what you've shared, because it's nowadays, I think people are becoming more comfortable with the idea of individual therapy and getting support in that way. But I think there is still a lot of resistance around group therapy, or whether it's therapy or not, just being comfortable sharing things in a group environment. And I think you've really shed light on how impactful that can be to connect with and become more vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I think
thank you
what
so
that
much for sharing.
does, I'm sorry. I was going to say, I think what that does, and I guess I said this before, and I know I shared about that retreat that I had been on, but I remember in that group sharing something that felt very vulnerable. I mean, just because I do this for a living doesn't mean that part goes away, and sharing something very vulnerable. And then multiple people had come up to me and let me know how much what I shared had resonated for them. And so I think, and it wasn't just me. I mean, I think we all were responding to each other in a similar way, but yeah, again, I guess just that permission and to trust that as you allow yourself to be human, that others will allow themselves to be human, and to not believe in some of that worth and flawed kind of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our listeners based on, what you've shared today and more about yourself?
Excuse me. I think often I talk about this from a place of this is the work that we need to do, and sort of the, connecting to yourself and getting quiet and connecting to other people. Just the richness of the relationships, that there's actually fun in them as well. It's not just work. It's not just tender. We laugh a lot in these group situations. We really recognize ourselves in each other, and we can enjoy that. And the connecting to ourselves, even though it can be so hard for some of us, that in the end, then you get to do things that you love and you enjoy and rest, or decide to do something fun that you don't typically allow for yourself. So I think it's that, just the enjoyment, that really it goes along with a lot of fun and connection and playfulness too.
Yeah, so it sounds like the process is really worth it, even when it feels uncomfortable. There is joy to be had from it, and there are benefits that can be obtained from listening to yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights today, Tanya. Can you let people know more about how they can connect with you? I know you mentioned having a retreat coming up, so how can they find out more about that and connect with you further?
Yeah. The easiest way to connect to me is through my website, and the easiest name I have for that is clearenergeticclutter.com.
Okay, awesome. And I will also leave links in the show notes so that people can just click there directly.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoy your podcast, and it's really nice to be connecting with you today.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.